Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here early in the morning in our Boston extended winter that just goes on and on and on. I'm very glad to see you. I know that we have had more responses for this occasion, and people will be coming in as the morning grows later. But I'm Lori Lefkowitz. I direct the Humanities Center, and with Tim Cresswell, who's our director for public humanities. And I just want to welcome you all here. Thank you for being here, and say that the the mission of the Humanities Center is largely to bring people together in interdisciplinary conversation, to create synergies, to foster research, to foster conversation among people across units, across the academy, across colleges, and with neighbor institutions. And our signature program is this fellowship program where we facilitate faculty getting together all year with a couple of graduate students in their midst to work on their own research and to collaborate and generate ideas and share papers. And we hope to spark conversations that will go on and on. And today represents a culminating occasion for that year-long study. We have distinguished guests with us from other places. I welcome you. Thank you for coming to Northeastern. We're very glad to have you. And I will take this opportunity to thank the College for Social Sciences and Humanities and Dean Ute Puiger, who's sitting in the back of the room, who really nurtures all of the programming of the Humanities Center and is so dedicated to this mission. And to thank Tim Cresswell, who has nurtured this year's fellowship program themed on space and place, which is his passion and lifelong work in multimedia, from academic study to poetry to varieties of expression. It's really a privilege to work with you, Tim. And I've heard such wonderful things about these conversations over the course of this year. And as always, I want to thank Megan Brisson, who is the administrator for the Humanities Center and makes everything happen. So thank you all. Thanks for being here, and I very much look forward to hearing what everybody has to say.
I want to reiterate all of those thanks, but add thanks to Laurie, of course. My name, by the way, I'm Tim Cresswell, in case you don't know. The Associate Director of Public Humanities in the Humanities Center, and I arrived in Northeastern in the summer of 2013 as a geographer without a geography department, in a history and international affairs program, and as part of a humanities center that was dedicated to interdisciplinary conversation. So I feel like I don't know if one of our guests, Mona Domosh, may talk about radical interdisciplinarity, but it's one of her things. But I feel radically interdisciplinary now. So today's event, as Laurie's already said, is a culmination of a academic year full of discussion of space and place between people from a number of different disciplines, some of whom you're going to hear from today. And this is the culminating event. It's going to be divided into two halves, just like a proper sports game. And the first half, we're going to have some distinguished visitors who have spent much of their time in recent years and in the past thinking about space and place from the different disciplinary perspectives. And in the second half, after a break, we're going to meet our fellows for the year who have been doing some great work and very inspiring conversations that I've been had a privilege to be part of over the year. We'll talk about interdisciplinarity in space and place and where that might go and how it's influenced their work over the year. So, like I said, in the first half we have three kind of 20-minute presentations followed by a chance for discussion and conversation, and I will get on with that right now. So. The guests we have, I'll introduce them all at once rather than one by one as we go along. So Peter Boll is visiting us from over the river in Harvard. He's been very central to developing geographical information systems work in Harvard. Many of you know the history of geography at Harvard, but it is one with blood on the floor and all kinds of things that went on back after World War II in particular, where there was a geography department and now there isn't. But there's been a long struggle around that, and Peter Boll has been very important in that, and is about to be made an honorary geographer at the AEG conference in a few weeks. So it's great to have him here. So his background is in history, particularly history in relation to China and history a long time ago. So it's not recent history, but ancient history. And he's also been responsible for developing online programming at Harvard. It's great to have him here because it sounds like he has an extraordinarily busy and important job at Harvard, being in charge of that particular process that's happening at the moment. Mona Domosh is visiting us from Dartmouth. She's a professor of geography, particularly a professor of historical geography and feminist historical geography in particular. And I've known Mona for a while. She's presently the president of the Association of American Geographers and has been dedicating much of her time as being president of that association to what, like I've already said, radical interdisciplinarity. Geography actually as radically interdisciplinary all by itself, which sounds like a strange thing because it's one discipline, but it does have that radical interdisciplinary to it. So space and place and landscape have been central to her work, obviously, as a geographer, an historical geographer. And Setha Low is an anthropologist at CUNY, and Setha has been involved in all kinds of very interesting work. This is actually the first time I've had the privilege of meeting her, but I've read her work a lot over the years, particularly early on about the use of public space in the plaza in South America. With some very innovative work there, but more recently involved with lots of other people in putting together some important documents for pedagogy in space and place, sort of collected essays or important essays of one kind or another, with a lot of the people at CUNY, none of whom are, I guess, technically are geographers, but as far as I'm concerned, all are geographers, who have various names like environmental psychologist or all kinds of, I don't know, what is David Harvey's position? What is he called? He's not called a geographer. Oh, he's okay. Yeah. Oh, so geography does get in there. Okay. Oh, okay. Cool. Okay. So it's fabulous to have all three of you here, and thank you for your time. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And hopefully, and like I say, afterwards, I will sort of introduce you in a shorter way each time, and then we'll have a discussion. So if I can just hand it over to Peter first, and the podium is yours.
Dennis Wood's proposition that maps are propositions, which they certainly are. This is a great map. It's the first grid map in human history that we still have. It's from 1136 in China, based on some notions of surveying, but in fact was an attempt to try to show how China at the time was related to China in 2000 BC. That was the goal of this map. It's called Traces of You. And the problem is that rivers move, so they couldn't actually figure it all out. That's another version of the same map. But GIS is propositions too. Just as much as a map is a proposition, so is a GIS. Because it's always a matter of making choices about what we're going to see, whether you're looking, this is the same place, right? This, or you can see it like that. And the thing that I find interesting about GIS is that it allows us to take different layers of information and put them, to disaggregate the different kinds of data you'd have on a map, and to aggregate them again as you please, and then to do it in a way that allows you to start to make sense out of the relationships between different kinds of information. How many of you here have done GIS? Okay, so it's not an overwhelming number, but some of you have. So I mean, basically GIS, you're using things like this, which are where every pixel has a value. In this case, to represent, with a bit of shading, to represent topography. You can put on that, you can put points on it. In this case, you're looking at the prefectural seats in red and county seats in black in 1820. You can put lines on it, you have rivers, right? You can put them all together. The nice thing then is you can start to say, well, what's the relationship between river systems and the location of administrative seats? In cities, are the north side rivers, south side rivers, they come where two rivers join together. And then you can start to do that across cultures as well. You find out that China and Europe are pretty similar in some of the ways they operate. But what I've been particularly interested in as an intellectual historian, which is my basic work, and Tim, it's not ancient. Ancient is like 5,000 years ago. I only do 1,000 years ago. That's modern history, pretty much. Is another big project on biographical data, which now is around 360,000 people in it, and careers and things like this. And one of the, China had a civil service examination system. The fact that we have civil service examinations in this country comes from Britain, and the British got it from the idea from the Chinese, right? In the 18th century, adopted it. And we have records of who passes the examinations. Now, it turns out that for the 12th century, 13th century, we only have 2 complete records. The examinations are given every 3 years, past 300 to 500 people, and they get government positions. So it's a good way, if you know where they come from, of seeing which areas are supplying really the national elite, which means the people who also produce the intellectual content that intellectual historians read. And so this was a map from one of the 2 years where we had complete data from 1148. And as you look at it, you'll see immediately that, wow, this is really clustered, right? If you think of this as disease instead, and you'd say, bad cancer area, pollution, something like this. But in fact, what we're talking about is people who pass the civil service examinations, who are regarded as the most educated, and people who enter government. So what this would mean then, if this is representative of the whole, because remember, we only have 2 years, is that there are whole parts of China that really aren't represented in government at all. Right? Maybe there are no people there. Who knows? Well, let's see. And so the way I handled this was, say, is that 1 year representative? And so we went through the biographical database and got around 7,000 people who passed the examinations between 1126 and 1279, and plotted that. And then we put the blue back dots, the 1148 dots on, and say, 1148 turns out to be pretty representative. So now we know something about Chinese history. And if you're going to say, where does intellectual life unfold, it's going to be where those dots are. Okay? And so that all, suddenly it sort of begins to focus your attention on certain areas which are producing more people. Now there's some demographic, is this same sort of thing. But this is the population map. And so one of the points of having the population up here is to show that, in fact, that representation in government was not correlated directly with population density. So something's going on in certain places that they're able to have a lock on entry into government, maintain educational institutions, which in China were largely privately funded, and get themselves a place and perpetuate themselves. And another way of looking at that is going a century or 2 later, where you have population on the left and then these colored dots on the right showing heavy concentrations of examination candidates or successful examination candidates. Again, we see that there's a distribution of that same distribution. So we're looking at this now over centuries, in fact. And then I said, well, let's look at this in comparison to the national highway system on the right, macro-regional analysis on the left, and well, it's not clear that it correlates awfully well with the highway system either. Now, there are lots of things we can do with lots of data, right? And in this case, the use of examinations to recruit a civil service really takes off in China in the late 10th century. Before that, it's a very, very minimal influence. And what you have instead are various kinds of nepotism, where your pedigree, your bloodline, determines who's going to get ahead. And you have highly networked state aristocratic elites. And this is an example of this. This is from the Tang Dynasty, the origins of the great clans, the people who supplied most of government. Compare this now with a situation that happens after the examination system is put into place. Right? And this is just showing civil officials from the next period. So you can see just the radical change that's taken place in representation, and yet still, this is I've just this doesn't give you the full sense of the clustering, but that clustering is still there. Now, there's another way of thinking about this, and part of this is an agitation against the reliance on GIS and Western notions of bounded space. Right? I'm interested in places. Places are things that people create. They gain meaning. They have attributes, as they say in the GIS world. But space is very often something geographers create. They draw boundaries. Or, in fact, beginning in the 1790, when you have the theodolite being used, you start to actually survey space in new ways, draw mathematically accurate maps, and that idea then becomes a very strong idea. So here we are looking at China in population by prefecture in the 11th century, based on Western notions of bounded space. And you'll see this area that I happen to be very interested in would be sort of probably the second or third tier in terms of population density. But if I look at another kind of map showing me what showing me elevations, I say, one moment, all the people, let's see, live right in these areas, right? A lot of this is mountainous. So one of the nice things about GIS is you can start to do simulations. You can say, well, if we have rivers running if we have slopes, then we know which way the water will fall. And for every drop of rain, we can figure out where the river systems ought to be, which you actually can with a great deal of accuracy. And then we know certain kinds of things, and we make certain kinds of assumptions about the slope people will or will not live on. And you know you can't live too close to a river because it floods and so on. And then you start to redraw your population. And when you do that, all of a sudden you find that, well, the population for this whole province turns out to be very concentrated. So originally I thought this area was where the population was, and this area, which I'm interested in, was a second tier. But in fact, this is a first tier. Right? And when you've seen lots of people together in a pre-modern society, you know that that things are more volatile. Property changes hands, information flows more quickly, people can intermarry more easily, transportation and goods will flow through those areas. And so once again, we started to create context in which we can look for historical events and make sense out of them. Here's another example. So this case, I was interested in two people, this guy Zhu Xi on the left and Lu Zuqian in purple. And I wanted to see, so they're very famous. And they're very famous, or so we thought, in their own time. So one of the advantages of this biographical database is we can track social relationships, friendships, enemies, student-teacher relations, all sorts of things. And what turned out was that these guys are, in fact, despite the fact that we think they had national reputations, when we look at their social relationships, they're highly clustered, they're regional. Right? And that starts to say, well, so we thought these people were just nationally famous philosophers, but maybe what they are really representatives of places, right? Maybe they are, in fact, the foremost people in a network of intellectuals in certain kinds of places. And they overlap. They overlap somewhat because they're actually allies, philosophical allies as well. But then I said, well, remember those civil service degree holders that passed the examinations? So let's do a map where the size of the circle, right, is proportionate to the number of people from that place who passed the examinations. Let's look at their social relationships on a map showing the civil service. And what we find right away is, these guys have social relations where a lot of people pass the civil service exams, meaning using civil service exams as a proxy for education, educational institutions, private academies, things like that. So that makes sense. I mean, they're intellectuals, they're philosophers, they talk to people who read books, people like us, and so that would be, it makes sense for them to have most connections there. But they don't have connections everywhere. And so when I look up here, I see that there are lots of people who pass examinations, but they don't have many connections. Now, anyone know what big city is up here? Ah, geographers? Geographers? Shanghai, one of the big cities in the world, right? This area right here is has been the economic center of China for the last 1,200 years. Tremendously rich area, and is again today, by the way. And right up there is not where they have their connections. Well, so went to another map. Did I do that? I cut out a slide I could have kept. Well, in any case, the slide you're seeing here has to do with commercial tax quotas. We happen to have a data set of commercial tax quotas from the 1070s, around 100 years before these guys were most active. But I'm going to assume that, and this is a dangerous assumption perhaps, that the distribution of commercial activity continued in this area, because it wasn't destroyed by war or anything like that, over the next century. And what we find, briefly stated, is that these guys have lots of connections, yes, but not an area where there's a lot of commercial activity. And then you say, aha, what kind of philosophers were these? It turns out there are philosophers who believe that you can make an absolute distinction between moral righteousness and profit. And that profit was not good. They're anti-commercial. They're anti-money. They're in favor of landed gentry, right? Nice, conservative, stable, social stability types. So once you think of that, you say, well, but of course. But it wasn't of course when we first looked at it. So this is one of the things I've sort of appreciated about working with GIS, that we can start to take different kinds of information. We can create contexts in which we see the phenomena we may be interested in. There's another whole branch of GIS which really is far more social sciencey and far more quantitative. And this goes back to Christoller's work in Germany on central place theory in the 1930s. And many of you will know that if you're interested in ideas of central places and networks of places. And G. William Skinner, an economic anthropologist, the late G. William Skinner, was terribly influenced by this and devoted much of his career to the study of this kind of place and regional systems. And he was the one who made the argument that China, but also other places, he also did work on Japan, on France, in the 19th century, that you could divide them into macro regions constituted by cores and peripheries, where the cores would tend to be the lowlands around major confluences of major rivers, and that, this is all of China today, but basically 90% of the Chinese population is always east of the line that comes like this. Right? So that China is big, but it's not that big in terms of where population is located. So this is a core periphery map. You know, the darker parts are cores, and the lighter parts are peripheries, and these are topographic macroregions. So actually, each one you'll see, if we look on this on a topographic map, you'd see that there's river systems, but then bounded in some sense by mountain ranges. And so it does make sense. In fact, this corresponds more or less to language groups. It has a considerable amount of historical validity. And Skinner got a hold of the 1991% sample from the Chinese census. This is data that would be like having the raw data from the U.S. Census. It's not something that governments give away, but somehow he got it, which allowed him to do extraordinary things, because in a census like this, one of the things he worked on was women's education. And if you're talking to 80-year-old women, you can start to say, well, did you go to school? How far in school did you go? We talk to 7-year-old women, 60-year-old women, so on, and you have almost a century of data on on women's education. But he wanted to do is show that these social phenomena correlated very directly with spatiality. And the question then was, how do you measure spatiality? And he did this by looking at core periphery zones. Here we have, and he got them down to a very, very, to the township level. Now that's all sort of massaged into a larger picture. But what we know, of course, is that you can have cores, you can have urban areas, core areas, way out in the countryside as well. So it's a more complicated picture than this lets on. It's somewhat more like this. But he also did that with an urban-rural continuum. So he has core peripheries, urban-rural continuum, and he wants to put the two together. And when he puts the two together, he can start to measure things by where the zone they're in of the core periphery zone, urban-rural continuum. And what he could show then, he claimed, was that there's a strict correlation between social phenomena and where you are in space. That's why I say this is really social science, quantitative social science. I'm not going to explain this because I think I've run out of time, but I am going to tell you an anecdote. So Skinner's notion was a spatial notion. He was talking about space. That's what he was interested in, and he wanted to see how human lives unfolded around space through differentiation of different kinds of space. These core periphery zones, urban-rural continuum. And shortly before he died, he asked me to go up because he wanted to give a lot of his stuff to Harvard. As you know, we're in the middle of a campaign, so we accept all gifts. But this was before then. And he wanted to see that there was a home for it. And he gave us, I think, 500,000 files, which has been, we've now, if you go to worldmap.harvard.edu and actually look for Skinner, you can start to download this, or through the through Dataverse, the Dataverse network, you can download his files. But I was out visiting him and I said, Bill, I just looked at some of your data, and these are the county seats in, I guess, 1820. And the Chinese had a system of looking at, of labeling county seats by whether they were busy or troublesome or difficult to govern and things like this. And I said, these are the county seats in 1820 that were labeled by the government as busy. And what do you think you're seeing here? Anyone? Roots, indeed, they're roots. The geographers immediately recognize their roots. I showed this to some historians that are those borders? What's going on? They're, of course, roots. And which is why they're busy, right? And actually, I looked at that, and of course, if you start to think in terms of places that are connected to each other along routes, you're not thinking in terms of core periphery zones. You're not thinking in terms of urban-rural continuum. It's actually not a space-based analysis at all. It's a place-based analysis. And Skinner looked at that, and one of his graduate students was behind, sort of standing behind us as we were at the computer, and the student says, "Those are networks." And Skinner says, next slide, right? Didn't want to see it. And so that, I think, gives us the choice, right? We in thinking about space and place, we are talking about possibly fundamentally different approaches to understanding human society and thinking about it. And there's a way in which, when I sort of have my intellectual historian's cap on, it's really about place and networks, where people are, who knows who, how they're connected together. But if you're thinking in Skinnerian terms of, these are, by the way, with looking at in terms of the national highway system, so you see, right, that's that, and you looking at in relationship to modern railroads, you see, and factually, that geographic routes sort of, they last a long time. They're embedded in the landscape, or the possibilities are in the landscape and they're constrained by landscape. But I do think that that's something we all have to think about, is that space and place actually offer us different ways of thinking about the world. So thank you very much.
Everybody hear me all right with this? Okay. First of all, just say what a pleasure it is, a real honor to be here with like-minded people who are interested in thinking about space and place. That's just a real treat for us. As Tim said, I am a geographer, so in some ways I'm like the ringer in the room, I suppose. But that doesn't, in some ways, that as it's a very interdisciplinary discipline. We're happy to have all you in geography. But probably like you, to me, space, place, and landscape are the ways I've always thought about the world, even long before I found this discipline called geography. I was just lucky enough to go to a university not too far from here, not even across the river, but inland, Clark University as an undergraduate. Small university with a big geography program, and therefore I took geography. Who knew, right? And I said, oh, this is it. This is what I've always thought about the world. This is how I see things and understand myself in the world. So when Tim asked me to do this, and I said it's a real honor, and I want to thank everyone who's made this possible, I thought, well, how could I talk about this that seems so integral to my life and was actually an interesting exercise to step back a little bit. And I thought all I could do is maybe walk me through my career in a way and to think about the different ways that space and place and landscape have mattered in my work. And so that's actually been an interesting exercise for myself. I hope it's an interesting exercise for you. In a way, it reflects the different ways that geographers are thinking about space, place, and landscape, the different theories, different paradigms, different ways, different political positions that we might have. But also, to me, just sort of always in some ways distinguishes me. I'm an historical geographer from what just history would be. So I shouldn't say just what history would be, but what history offers that historical geography might have a little bit more to offer in terms of thinking about space, place, and landscape. So with all that, just a very quick kind of summary of where I've come from. What do I do? I realize I'm in a potential stop issue with that one, so I won't put that there. That could be a disaster waiting. So I realize, I think back on my 30-year career, my goodness, a lot of what I've been trying to do is try and understand the making of an American empire. My joke is a very small topic. That's you're supposed to laugh. But what I mean by that is the way that American power, economic power particularly, because if you think about the United States as a power in the 20th century, which is really what I've focused on, we, of course, were military power, but we started off really as an economic power. So I've spent a lot of 30-some years trying to think through that process. And, of course, it's a spatial process. It's about how things happen and move through time and space. So I start off with a quote by Neil Smith, because at least he lists all the different ways that power and empire might happen. And I started off long before Neil Smith wrote this, and probably when I didn't think I was thinking of empire, I started off thinking about my most exciting city that I'm very much a fan of as a center of what we today would call the American empire, which is to think about New York City. And my dissertation was on a very, at the time, mundane way, I would call it, to think about, this is a long time ago when geography did different kinds of things. And my dissertation was try to understand and document. So this was very much like a very map before we even had GIS, Peter. So I had all these strange early database stuff to map the places where skyscrapers were developed in the city. So that was my original dissertation project. So I had file cards just now being put into a computer system. It was just happening. And I really tried to understand where and why did buildings become tall in the city. So it was a very geographical, my dissertation is just filled with 50 maps. It's very much a two-dimensional idea of that. And I found that very interesting and satisfying in a certain kind of way. But of course, what I realized was that my original assumptions about what was happening in the city, this growth, were incorrect. And this is back when urban historical geography, was about answering very kind of, we would say, positivistic questions. And the assumption was that buildings would go tall, right, when there was enough pressure on that piece of land to generate enough money to grow tall, meaning they had to be in very valuable places, the most accessible points in the city. Urban Geography 101, I know all of you will be fascinated by this. I teach this in my classes, right? So we call this the peak land value intersection, the major spot within the city that would command the highest rents. That would be pressure on that land to build tall, right? Makes a lot of sense? Okay, so that was the assumption, and the assumption would be then that buildings would be tall, would grow tall, skyscrapers would happen in those places, and you could document those places. Well, I spent years, documenting real estate and tax data to see which spaces in the city actually commanded the highest land rents. And it turns out, of course, that my assumptions were incorrect. That, in fact, it wasn't necessarily the places that commanded the highest land rent that had the tallest buildings. And so I had to think, well, why not? And of course, I kind of knew all along that probably wasn't going to be right, and it's much more fun when it's not right? That makes it much more interesting. And so what I found out is that buildings were being built tall for reasons other than just to make the most economic land rent. They were being built tall to express, to represent, to symbolize something. Whoa. This was in the 80s, and Tim can tell you that that was sort of a new idea at the time. Wasn't new in anthropology, but it was kind of new in geography. And so I kind of made my original, claim to something by talking about tall buildings as being symbolic. And I began, woo. And in fact, the first tall buildings were these buildings. They don't look particularly exciting today. Some of them are still there. They were the newspaper buildings. That's the New York World and the New York Tribune and the New York Times building built around City Hall Park, Definitely not the spot of the peak land value intersection, not the highest land values at all, but places where the newspaper industry had been located traditionally, and they kind of began a sort of war, a competition to have the tallest building, to show that in some ways, perhaps the height of their building was in relation to the length of their subscription lists. That's what one cynic said at the time. So they began this kind of height competition, hiring the latest architects, trying to show off their money, their power, their prestige. And you know, this is also at the time when newspapers were owned by kind of, well, I guess they still are, when we actually had real competition in newspapers, right? They weren't all owned by the same people. And they were all about showing off their own kind of maybe macho-ness, their own power, and their own economic prestige in the city. So that got me into thinking about symbolism and thinking about landscape per se as more than simply a movement around a city or a place in terms of land rent, but about people and how they thought about them and how they represented them. So I started a whole trajectory thinking about symbolism, landscape, representation. And that was pretty exciting for me for quite a long time. And geography was new and risky. I know Tim can look at that. And I began a whole other study. I had no guidance in this. So we had some very early people in geography trying to think this through, and I was excited about them, but most of them were doing rural work, and so I was trying to translate into the city. So I started a whole study of postcards of the city, because I thought people were buying these, making them, and sending them around. Of course, they were also great material to collect because they're cheap, right? I think I bought all these for about 10 cents each. But you can see that this was something that people at the time were writing in this postcard. This is Lena saying, does this look natural? Because the notion was, and you've probably heard about this, that these were being compared to canyonscapes. And how do we think about the natural landscape and the physical landscape and the human landscape in sort of interesting metaphors here? So I began a whole sort of thing that began to look at landscape then as symbolism, as representation, represented in images. I hung out with a lot of art historians for a while, tried to figure out what they were doing. It was an exciting time, and I learned a lot. Now, while I was involved in that project thinking about New York City, I was also inspired and had started to map something else in the city, and that was what we would call the beginnings of a retail district. So if you're looking two-dimensionally down at a city, I was looking at the tall skyscrapers, and many times that's actually looking at the commercial center of the city, banking, finance, newspaper, PR, all those. And I began to realize, that was actually in relationship to another parts of the city called retail districts. You know what retail districts are. We more colloquially call them shopping, right? Shopping districts. So I began to map shopping districts. You realize New York City was the first place that really developed this shopping, this retail area. By retail, I mean retail without wholesaling. I mean just actual spaces just for shopping. And I got very interested in thinking about the gendered connotations of that, and thinking through what the beginning of kind of feminist theories about gendered roles in the late 19th, early 20th century, and how it was and why it was. And it wasn't necessarily for a progressive cause that women became the class of shoppers. Women weren't born to shop. It's actually not true. For a bunch of reasons that actually served the people in power to create a class of people whose job supposedly was to shop was actually very good for business. And because this was about bourgeois women coming into the city to shop and to be part of the downtown, that meant that the spaces in the city, the actual three-dimensional spaces, had to appear to fit into 19th and early 20th century ideas of being a bourgeois woman, which was to look kind of domestic and cultural and pretty, and not to look commercial and industrial, which is what a lot of downtown New York was looking like. So I really began to think then about landscape in a very three-dimensional, lived experience, to think about in what ways then the city, literally New York and many other cities, were reshaped around gendered notions of female and male at the time. This is not a feminist space, right? These were just gendered ideals of what women were supposed to be doing. One of the first places that does this is the first department store in New York City, Stewart's Department Store. It's built right around City Hall Park, just the other side of where those skyscrapers were. It was marble fronted. It was meant not to look like a commercial building, but to look very much like a civic building. Therefore, bourgeois women could be in this space and still not contradict gender ideology. And you see this kind of lithograph of sort of proper bourgeois women getting off their carriage, the carriage trade, and coming into Stewart's Department Store. Stewart, of course, outgrows that space. The retail district moves north, and he builds, about 30 years later, this giant, which now people often think of as the first giant department store. Actually, that first department store is still in the city, in case anyone's interested. This one is gone, it burned down. But this was his cast iron store that was built, Cast Iron Palace it was called, and it was built particularly with gendered notions of what was an appropriate space for women to be in. And one of the few images we have inside is this. If you get a grip of that image, it's hard to, can you see it? So it's almost before, really didn't have electricity. So you're trying to get natural light in, so it was built in this kind of arcade, almost like a theater, if you think about it. And I love this image for many reasons. You can actually see what the selling floor was like. But of course, it's a bourgeois woman teaching her daughter the appropriate bourgeois skills, right? Which is, first of all, it's the first time women were allowed to be in the city by themselves, unescorted, right? They could be, otherwise they had to be with men, or else they were considered streetwalkers, right? So you had to be really careful where you were and what you did. So I got into thinking about spaces, inside spaces, interior spaces, the experience, the gendered connotations of those spaces, and to think about retail districts as not just retail districts, but as shopping places. And what did shopping mean? And what did shopping mean for women? So you can see my kind of two-dimensional interests in space began to sort of explode here a little bit, and I moved into reading lots of other kinds of works. And I did that for quite a long time, so that was fun. That was very interesting and fun. I still do this. I mean, it's not, but I'm trying to give you different ideas of how space and place and landscape have worked in my work, have come through into my work. And then, of course, always I was interested in New York. Why was I interested in New York? Well, it seemed it was the center of this American thing, this American power. I wasn't yet calling it empire. But I was very much inspired by a lot of the post-colonial work being done in the UK, particularly in historical geography, rethinking the British Empire, work by history in the United States, rethinking an American empire. And so I just had lucky enough in the early 90s to have, or I guess mid-90s, to have a year off, and I actually could read all that work. That's how you have sabbaticals. You get to read things. And to be inspired a little bit about what would an American empire mean. And if you look here, this is in the early 20th century, the skyline of New York. Often the emblem, the representation, right, of American economic power. And I use this image. You can probably figure this is the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So you have a sense of a very iconic building or iconic structure. We all know about that. But you can see many other iconic buildings. And I'm just pointing out this at the time. This is the tallest building in the city at the time. This is about 1910. I don't know if real New Yorkers, that would be Seth, might know what that building is. Unfortunately, it's long gone. It's the Singer building, Singer sewing machines. And Singer sewing machines, Singer was the largest, at that time, the largest international company in the United States. No, you don't understand that. Sewing machines were the largest international markets. At the time, we were the producers for the world. We were making machinery, particularly domestic machinery, and we were selling it. Singer Sewing Machine was our largest corporation in terms of having international markets, and you can see it's represented here in this building, right, in downtown New York. It is the tallest building. So this is just to indicate that then my work began to look at the ways that these large American corporations literally begin to move through time and space. How did they become international corporations? And I said, as a geographer, my interests were very, and maybe this is just me, very grounded, very much about the materiality of that. We could look at documents about foreign policy. How did that happen in foreign policy? We could look at documents that actually trace the corporate structures and how that changed, and that's all very interesting too. But I was actually really interested in the material ways it happened. How did these corporations move through time and space? And again, I was lucky enough to have some time to do this, and I've actually gotten funded for all my work from the National Science Foundation. One of the wonderful things about being a geographer is that we fall within the Academy of Sciences, we fall under the Division of Science. And Tim, I even can get funded. I would say I do historical, but anyway, it's a sneaky thing, but I get funded to do this work. And so I have, I think Peter might be a little upset with these maps, but these are maps showing the extent of the internationalization of some of our American companies at the time. This is actually a World War I base map. I was trying to give you a sense of what the World War I lines were like. So we're looking at the expanse, the spread of Singer sewing machines, where these are actually their central offices. Another corporation I was very interested in, the second largest international corporation at the time, was a company that made farm machinery, McCormick, that then becomes International Harvester. The things I know about is just quite shocking. Okay, so here's their internationalization, if you look at them in maps. And the other corporation I'll talk about very briefly is a corporation that you're very familiar with, because I think they have offices all around here. This is the global spread of, in the early 20th century, of Citibank. Originally called the First National City Bank of New York City, and we today call it Citibank. So these are some of the corporations that I try to follow in their diffusion. I think it's, to use a good old geography word. How did it happen? And in the first project, what I really began to understand, and I kind of went back to my representational symbolic mode, is I really began to understand that they were used, these companies weren't necessarily, the largest percentage of their market wasn't overseas, but they were so excited that they had these international markets that they used their internationalism to sell their products to Americans, right? This is the time the United States, it's hard to believe this, on the cusp of World War I, was not a global economic power, right? World War I is sort of a turning point here. We were not that. We were just a kind of young thing creeping up there. And so to have international markets was very exciting for these corporations, very much used as their advertisement. So the first set of projects I became engaged in were, by happenstance, thinking about how they use their international experiences to sell things in the United States, very much about consumption. This is actually an advertisement from International Harvester, McCormick at the time. Some of you in art history who have a art history background or are really diehard geographers, maybe Tim knows this, would realize that this is actually based on the trope of a Renaissance painting called the geography lesson. Aha, some of you know that. Okay, and probably not unknown to many of the viewers at the time. This was on their catalog. It became an image that was very, very circulated. And it's of a patriarch teaching his children about the world. It's the geography lesson. And on the, I know you can't see it, on the globe it says, "Listen, children, you will see on this globe the harvest fields where the McCormick is ever king." You know, the International Harvester. What has the McCormick brought to the United States? Well, it's brought this, right? It's brought prosperity. It's brought this fabulous Victorian interior in New York City with the planter and the gilded mirror and the wonderful carpet. And even his daughter has the atlas out. She might be looking through some things and maybe learning something. And what has brought this? This is like the geography lesson. We are teaching these American corporations. We're teaching Americans, in some ways, geography lessons, right? Teaching them about the world through their advertisements. So I set out on a project that began to understand what were the stories they were telling, what were the narratives that they were using to teach Americans about the world. So in a way, another set of ideas of space and place, right? An imaginative, what were the imaginations of this globe that these corporations were building on? This is also from International Harvester. It's supposed to be about the course of history. You know, people started off here in the olden days, reapers of the ancient Gauls. And then here, they're just beginning, women are still in the field working. That means that things aren't really civilized, right? This discourse of civilization becomes very prominent. And then, of course, today, we're over here. We're men on machines, and that's really modern America. So many of these corporations like Singer, International Harvester, and Citibank were using this discourse of civilization. You know, we were on stages, and everyone's on stages. And we Americans are the best. We're at the top. But what's interesting about this is I know you've read some work by Doreen Massey, and we're really, I know you won't believe this, but this is actually Doreen Massey's here. Because if you look at this inset, this is the interesting thing about this image. It's actually supposed to be showing farmers in India today, i.e. when this image was made. And who is the farmer in India today? So India represents our past, right? India is the past. So I know if you've read Doreen Massey's work about the transposition of time and space, I think you can see that this was very much a trope that was used all the time. We still do this, right? Parts of the world are still imagined as our past, right? That's a kind of, Emma McClintock has written about that and Doreen Massey. So this was these are the kinds of images that were going on. So I then wrote a book about this and kind of looked at all these images and representations. How did these corporations use them and what were they teaching Americans about the world? And this is there, I'll just end with that. So I probably don't need to interpret this image very much. This is from their newsletter in 1927 when International Harvester, I guess, is Santa and is giving the world to everybody or has encircled the world in their machines or whatever it is. They now have, they are running the show, right? And in fact, in 1927, some people date as the year that America, you know, or New York City, we might say, takes over from the financial markets from London, right? So it controls the financial economy of the world, quote unquote. Okay, so that was that project. Singer also, of course, uses images of the globe. So again, I got to thinking about the imaginative geographies to show that they are on top as well. But they have a particular way of thinking about how and why they're on top. Here you can see again, this is the globe, this is Singer, and it's about women because Singer sewing machines, even though many of them were used for industrial purposes, their advertisements were all about domestic use, and they were all geared toward women. So the notion was that as a civilized American woman, you were helping bring civilization to the world by using your Singer sewing machine, and you might even have a little bit of sisterhood with your fellow women around the world who were all using Singer sewing machines. You might be interested. Peter, we have 3 images of China just by happenstance here. Yes, they were very much into depicting women in the invented traditions of these costumes of certain places. If you want to think about that, of course, sewing machines are about making clothes, so of course they were interested in clothing as well in Korea. But this is actually women. This is, you can see, was collecting these trade cards. They were given out for free to many women, to most women who bought sewing machines. So again, I wrote a lot about these kinds of sisterhood, these imagined notions of sisterhood, and what did that mean for American women when they were buying these sewing machines. And you can see it was on I love the book. It's originally an accounting book that then became a children's practicing book, and then became a place to put your cards. Okay, and then I become like, okay, enough of that. I like representations and I like all that, but I want to get back to, like, material stuff. So back to the Singer Building. I realized I started then thinking through the actual landscapes of this process, and you can see that when Singer was completing its tallest building in the world in New York City, at the very same time it was building that building, this building was also under construction, and this is Singer's headquarters in St. Petersburg. So I don't know if you've been there, but it's still there. I just was there last year, and still looks, this is not such an old image. And it was, at the time, the tallest building in St. Petersburg. It had to break all the laws to get that thing on the very top. And again, I want to think about the landscapes. What were the buildings? What were the shapes? What were the spaces? How did they actually do this? You can imagine in a time when the United States did not have geopolitical power and had very little military power. So it was doing this. It was building factories and buildings and offices in all parts of the world where it had very, very little political control. And it was a very interesting process. So I started thinking through space again in this different kind of more material way. This is its large factory complex just outside of Moscow in Podolsk, which is also still existent and still there. I've gone to see that. It's hard to get a grip of. They had to build their own foundries. They had to put in their own electricity. They built their own railroads. It was quite the undertaking. Russia is a big place, as you can imagine. And they had offices everywhere. And they shipped from this factory to much of parts of Russia and parts of Europe. So anyway, I began to think about this process, the actual building of buildings, the people who were involved in it, how did it happen, the architects that were hired, so on and so forth. This is their largest complex, which is outside of Glasgow. So I looked at Scotland a lot. This is the place that started what we might today call Red Clydeside, if you know that, all the strikes outside of in Scotland. The Singer Works had the first giant strike, and it was a strike against the Americanization of the so-called old way of doing work, quote unquote. That's from Singer. And it was an interesting strike for many reasons, and I've written about that, but I won't talk about it. So anyway, I was thinking about how it is that you impose, right, your ways of doing work, American ways of doing work on different places, and how did this happen in these particular sites. It spread, of course, to Podolsk. They had 3 other factories, and it was an interesting, and in Jersey City, where the other factory was in the United States. Oh, this is the International Harvesters Factory just outside Moscow as well, for those who speak Russian. I can translate, I don't, but I can fake it. Okay, so, all right. So you had a sense of that project and what was happening, thinking about, again, I was trying to get thinking materially about landscape and how did the actual day-to-day processes happen. And while I was in that work, I was very much influenced by what we may today is going on in economic geography. I was thinking about this term embeddedness. And embeddedness is a way of thinking literally about how people are embedded in place. You know, we sometimes can't, we have our friends socially embedded, sometimes we're economically embedded, we're embedded through transport linkages. So I took that term and tried to think about, well, how were these American companies then were they embedded in these countries? And what did that mean? What were their networks, like Peter was talking about? And I ended this project with this story of these 2 interesting men, because Walter Dixon was the head of that giant factory in Podolsk. He was a big guy for Singer. And Boyce Hart becomes a vice president in Citibank, and he just started working for Citibank in the early 20th century, gets sent to open their St. Petersburg office in the summer of 1917. So you might remember that date. He absolutely is totally unembedded. He knows no Russian. He arrives in the middle of the revolution. Walter Dixon had lived in Russia for 25 years. He had a Russian wife. He knew everything about what was happening. He understood the situation. And Dixon, therefore, this is from Boyce Hart Left a Photo album. So this is actually his album of the Russian Revolution on the streets. So you can just see he has a memoir as well. It's quite fascinating. He's clueless. I have his memoir. Clueless about what goes on. Citibank, when they lost their money invested in Russia, they, of course, had lent huge amounts of money to the Russian government. They lost all of their investments in Russia. Almost went bankrupt. Almost as bad as the Great Recession. The president was fired from Citibank, all because of the sort of, I would call, lack of embeddedness. This company had no idea what was really happening. Whereas Singer and Dixon he worked very, very smoothly to get Singer investments out of the country as quickly as he could. And you can see here, this is actually from the 1930s, images of the Podolsk factory. And this was actually his office, which is now, as you can see, a playground for young Soviet citizens. So the actual building stayed, and Singer lost a lot of money, but not as much nearly as it would have been. So I actually tried to think about what does it mean to be embedded? Who are the people who did it? How did they actually operate an American empire? How did that happen on the ground? Okay, almost done. While I was working on this, one of the biggest markets I didn't talk about was Argentina. So Russia was America's largest market. Argentina was our second largest market for many of our products, but particularly International Harvester, you can imagine, was really big into Argentina. While I was looking at the archives about Argentina, I saw a misfiled folder, which is always the great part about doing archival work. It's a treasure hunt. You never quite know what you're going to find. And in this folder was a folder called Alabama. I thought, what's Alabama doing here? So I go talk to the archivist, and he goes, oh, Alabama. He goes, International Harvester was obsessed with Alabama. I said, oh, that's interesting. Like a good scholar that I was, I looked at it briefly, put it aside, and said, Mona, come back later. Just finish up what you're doing. Okay, so I did, and I'm lucky enough, my recent project, which I just got funded for, is to think about why it was American companies, but also the American government was heavily obsessed. That's a contradiction. But anyway, was obsessed with the American South in the first part of the 20th century. What I began to realize is they were obsessed with it as a region. So another way to think about space and place, these regions, these imagined regions. The American South has always been imagined as something different. Perhaps at that time was being imagined as something diseased and something unmodern. And International Harvester was very much into that as well, and they sent their people, their experts, to the American South to intervene here to make farmers more modern. But particularly, they were interested in women, and particularly in the domestic household. And what I found out is that this becomes, in some ways, my argument is, a practicing ground for what American power is going to do in 1945, 46, 47, which is to begin international development. International development begins around agricultural uses, and it's particularly around trying to modernize, quote unquote, farm families. And so this new project I have is looking at that sort of process. This is from an International Harvester archive that they did these couple campaigns with the South, and took these images, and you can see the caption says it all. The women and two young girls in a field. Original caption reads, this picture was not taken in Egypt, nor India, nor Africa, but in Alabama, near Enon, and shows the primitive methods still in use among the miserably poor colored people of the South. So there's my project, right there. Not quite, but done. Anyway, so again, thinking about space, place, landscape in a different sort of way, which is thinking about the kind of regional, still thinking about power, because it seems to me this is really about how Americans learn to become the global power. You can see they're comparing that. This is also from International Harvester. This is they're at the same time their image of Egypt, but at least it's a man working a plow instead of women. That was always a sign of even more backwardness. You can see this is International Harvester's documents. They were just obsessed with the South, as you can see. And this is actually their map that they produce showing where they're going to invest all their money. They're going to send all these people, all their experts. They hire experts to go down and help modernize farmers here in the American South. And you can see more images. These are the so-called women being sent from International Harvester to home economics people to come tell these women why what they're doing is not modern. But it's not, I said, it's not just USDA. Then it's not just International Harvester. I realized this was huge. The United States Department of Agriculture had a giant effort in cooperative extension to intervene in the lives of farmers in the American South, and particularly around the domestic, and particularly around women, and it becomes around health and what we today would call kind of a biopolitical intervention. So this is, of course, a staged image. What they were doing is teaching people how to have better houses. This is supposed to be farms, right? But remember, these are houses. So it's clearly an unhealthy, non-modern house. It has no windows, no screens. It looks very slovenly. Things are broken. People are just lying about. We could do a whole set of interesting analysis of this image. And then, of course, right next to it, this is from the USDA, is the after image in this farm in Alabama, where, of course, everything has now been made right. They have the clapboards have been put right. There's screens. There's windows. There's a porch. And there's even a garden. This is it. They've got it. And this is an image from that same set of images that looking at how they're going to start very much obsessing on health. And I have a whole interesting thing about what was about health. We know one of the key indicators even today in international development is always about fertility, and that's always about birth rates, right? Birth rates and child rates. So this is actually people showing, we have a doctor here who's recording the birth rates, right? And showing women how to do this and keep track so we can keep track of our population here in the American South. A sign, again, we can track then, a sign of modernity. And what I began to realize is this becomes a practicing ground. This is in 1944, 45, just before the end of World War II. Those people who were involved in cooperative education in the United States convene a conference a very important conference, just a couple months after another important conference was held. This one's in D.C. in 1944, just before the war ends. This is a conference that's held just a couple months after another conference that was held in a small town in New Hampshire. You might know that small town, Bretton Woods, where the global financial policies were established, let's say. And I would be provocative by saying this conference was equally important, because here what they're doing is they're bringing together, you can't see the title, extension work in the United States to see how they're going to bring it to the rest of the world. And they follow that conference up with this conference, 1949. They're bringing together all these people who work in American extension, particularly in the American South, to see how they're going to bring these practices to the rest of the creation of, because now it's not, you can see, there it is. They've now added Africa and Latin America to the list. You know, it becomes the invention of the third world, and you can see what's going to be happening here. 50s, this gets morphed into these kinds of images in the 50s. I got very interested in thinking about home economics around the world. I love this one because it's the generic third world. If you look interesting, again, if you think about the place, again, very landscape, see? It's like a village, there's palm trees, there's a desert, there's everything in that image. So we've got the generic third world. And it becomes a homemaking handbook. They're still being reproduced today by the Peace Corps, word for word, sections of it out of USDA's Guide to the American South in the 1920s, 1930s. So very interesting. And I'll end with this one last image from that homemaking handbook. You can see this is in India. We have someone here trained to be the nurse who's weighing on a scale on a table and showing Indian women how to record birth rates of their children. And of course, you might remember this image, which was from about 35 years earlier. So that's it. Those were all my career in 20 minutes. Thanks.
Actually, this is quite a treat, and again, I want to thank Tim for inviting me, and Megan for getting me here and taking care of all the logistics. But you're also going to get a treat in that this is now an anthropologist read, which is really, ooh, that didn't work. Okay, let's just see. There, and I'm going to move myself because I do want to keep track of the slides. And I hadn't really known what this would be about. And so what I did is actually, I didn't realize, it's a little bit like Mona, but I'm working on a book called Spatializing Culture, the Ethnography of Space and Place. And unlike many of you, space and place for me are interlocked. I think you'll see that. But I decided, since I have the privilege of talking to you, and maybe you'd give me some feedback, this expanded understanding of space and place, and for me, its methodological implications, is the centerpiece of the current research and writing I'm doing. I'm hoping in 20 minutes to briefly review the different approaches and illustrate their applications with ethnographic examples. The field work is crucial to demonstrate not just the theoretical development of the idea of spatializing culture, but how it can be used in undertaking ethnographies of space and place that are quite different. I have found that spatializing culture, that is, studying culture, social relations, and political economy through the lens of space and place, provides a powerful tool for uncovering material and representational injustice and forms of social exclusion. Both of you, it's sort of interesting that we're using space and place to uncover certain kinds of things. At the same time, it facilitates an important form of public engagement, because such spatial analyses offer people and their communities a new way to understand the everyday locations where they live, work, shop, and socialize. It also provides a basis for resisting proposed development and the impact of other neighborhood transformations that can destroy centers of social life, erase cultural meanings, and restrict local participatory practices. And these are just some of the systems, I'm not going to go through it, of injustice that I've been working on over my career. Now, while many anthropologists study the structural basis of exclusion through a number of approaches, especially political economy, and as we just heard, historical analysis, there are only a few anthropologists who utilize space and spatial relations. The study of space can direct attention to social and spatial arrangements that are presumed to be given and fixed, and therefore constitute natural and simply the way things should be. Instead, as Mona has just, I think, greatly illustrated, when critically examined, space and spatial relations yield insights into unacknowledged biases, prejudices, and inequalities that frequently go unexamined. Now, The concept that I use builds on the work of many anthropologists. And I guess you have been reading this seminar, I don't know, but very briefly, I start with Hilda Cooper's seminal article on political space and ethnographies that study architecture and culture. It emerged while I was working collectively with a group of urban anthropologists who employed space and the built environment to interrogate the city. I think that's the part of my work most of you know. It continued to be shaped by the work of Deborah Pello on sociospatial organization, and of course from reading this French theorists, geographers, and anthropologists who elucidate space and spatial relations in terms of power dynamics and meanings of everyday life. Many of the examples, for example, drawing on Foucault, you might know the work of Paul Rabineau, who was one of the first anthropologists to link the growth of modern forms of political power with the evolution of aesthetic theory and analyze how French colonists in North Africa exploited architectural and urban planning to reflect their cultural superiority. Again, very similar to, in fact, the two historical examples. And of course, Henri Lefebvre's foundational work on the production of space adds that space is never empty, it always embodies a meaning. And his well-known argument that space is not transparent, but must be queried through an analysis of spatial representations, spatial practices, and spaces of representation is the basis of many anthropological analyses. Margaret Rodman and Miles Richardson, on the other hand, and this is the other side that I'm drawing upon, rely on phenomenology and theories of lived space to focus attention on how different actors construct, contest, and ground their personal experience. Alberto Cosino Jimenez goes even further and insists that space is no longer a category of fixed and ontological attributes, but a becoming, an emergent property of social relations. Sorry, I have definitely gotten a cold. Sorry. Put somewhat differently, he notes that social relations are inherently spatial, and space an instrument and dimension of space's sociality. And as you can see here, Thrift and Amin, Cresswell, Eingold, Rockefeller on bodies and mobilities has most heavily influenced my most recent work. Now in my own work, in my own work, I initially proposed a dialogical process to explain how culture is spatialized. In that analysis, the social production of space, that's just what I call it, includes all those factors, social, economic, ideological, and technological, that result or seek to result in the physical creation of the material setting. The term social construction was reserved for the, let me see, I think, here we go, social production. The social construction of space was reserved for people's exchanges, memories, images, daily use of material settings, symbolic interpretations, and into scenes and actions that convey symbolic meaning. Both processes I see as social in the sense that both production and construction are mediated by social processes such as they're always contested, they're always fought over for ideological and economic reasons. Now, unfortunately, for me, the co-production model, which you find in the first book on the plaza, was really limited by its binary structure. Adding the construct of embodied space to social construction and social production solves much of this problem. It's the way, I think, Tim, that you use place as a way to, quote, solve the problem. But I'm still trying to keep space and place together. So I solved it by thinking about embodiment. By embodied space, I mean conceiving of the person as a mobile spatial unit, literally, physically, a spatio-temporal unit with feelings, thoughts, preferences, and intentions, as well as out-of-awareness cultural beliefs and practices, and actually trajectory and roots. I was thinking, Peter, when you were talking about it, I literally see those bodies as moving along those roots. The person thus creates space as a potentiality for social relations, giving it meaning, form, and ultimately, through the patterning of everyday movements, produces space and landscape. Further, The addition of language, new digital technologies, and discourse theories expand the conceptualization of spatializing culture by examining how talk, the internet, and new media are deployed to transform meaning of practices and spaces. Emotions and affect also play a critical role in changing space and place through their ability to color and inform behavior and practices in their interpretation. For example, gated community residents' discourse of fear. I've spent a lot of time working with gated communities, and their fear of others plays a very critical role in sustaining the spatial preference for and cultural acceptance of these walled and gated developments. And finally, probably the most radical of my ideas at this point, translocal and transnational processes are increasingly creating new spaces where immigrants and displaced persons can experience multiple and distant spaces simultaneously through their embodied emplacements. So these 6 approaches all come together to develop what I think is important for an ethnographic analysis of space and place. Now, what I'd like to do, doing all right on time, okay. I'm sort of giving labels to a lot of the things that we've already talked about here, and so maybe we can pull that out in the discussion. The social construction and social production approaches are really employ the bulk of ethnographic work. If you read anthropology, that's and on space and place, that's really what you'll be talking about. These other approaches are really much less well used, and I think really are leading us into new directions, at least for the anthropologists. And some aspects, such as embodied space, affective atmospheres, translocal space, in which I'm really imagining people are living in 2 and 3 places at one time, they integrate some of the social and material dimensions of space and place in intriguing ways, which is part of what I'm trying to solve. I'm trying to make, as Peter was saying, you say I study place, which is where people are, but I think really you're studying space and place as they're interlocking, and that's been my struggle to empirically try to show how that works. So let me just very briefly give you a little history of the kinds of research I've done that's led me to thinking about these. So social production of space. Some of you know that I was involved in a long archival project, also archive and site-specific project in which I was trying to trace the origins of the Spanish American Plaza, the Latin American Plaza. And I looked in Europe at the Bastides, and which are of Roman formation, and then went back all over Europe and looked that there were no good planned towns, of course, in Europe. Everybody's telling me in Costa Rica that the plaza, of course, is a European form. I should be clear. In 40 years of research, plaza is a European form. I go to Spain, where supposedly everybody came from, and it's all medieval twisted things. And more importantly, the plazas that everybody sent me to look at were built in 1619. And for those of you who are not New World Mesoamericanists like me, you know that by about 1501, 1507 is when, in fact, the conquistadors are there in Tenochtitlan, and they are going to build the first Mexico City. So I'm being really brief. But here is Hernan Cortez's letter, gotten at Brown University, at John Carter Brown Library, that Cortez is sending back, of a kind of grid plan town. Oh, I took out one of the slides. I have a couple of these grid plan towns. And not only that, there begins to be, about 2000, a series of archaeological projects that actually trace what goes on at that moment in time, which up to that time we didn't have. And you find, in fact, superposition. You have continuous occupation, and in fact, what's really going on is the church and the plaza are being torn off and replaced. If you go to Mexico City, you can see the Templo Mayor of the Aztecs right next to the cathedral, there in the Zocalo, all in the same place. And I came to the conclusion that, in fact, it's a syncretic form, that the Latin American Plaza is as much based on superposition of the original indigenous planning and architecture of the site. Okay, so that was my thing, social construction. Social construction is really what anthropologists do. I was thinking about critiques. It's about how people make space into place is the normal way people talk about it. And here I am in Parque Central that I've just explained is in fact partially an indigenous form, and I'm looking at the traditional users, the shoe shine men. I really can't go over this very slowly, but all the people who use my plaza and make it theirs, the pensioners who meet in the street, the shoppers on the corner, and I spend a couple of years living at this plaza and learning everybody is there, and the gamblers who play the cap game and who also exchange stolen articles. And then what happens is, so they make this place their own. It has all their meanings and movements. It's a socially constructed space of great value. It's then redesigned. Don't have time to go into it. With that redesign, they move everyone out. It becomes an incredibly dangerous place. Gangs move in and take over because all of the traditional users aren't there. And part of my current activism about public space is these are very fragile ecologies that you don't mess with in these ways if you want to have kinds of lively public space. Embodied space came out a little later, field work of a Latino market. This is an old New York market. This is one of the original Moore Street markets, one of the original 9 markets built in 1940 that has become a space for Latinos, particularly Caribbean, Dominican, Puerto Rican, but also now Mexican and Nicaraguan and Ecuadorian space for them to stay in. And I spent a lot of time there tracing people's bodily movements in this space and began to argue that really embodiment was the music, the sound, the smells, again, that the richness of that was telling me what this space was much more than its social production. Not that it wasn't socially produced to civilize housewives, as Mona's talking about. Again, you were supposed to get clean meat here, not from vendors on the street. But at the same time, a lot of other things were going on here that made the experience of this now place quite important to this neighborhood. And we were actually helping the vendors try to hold on to this market, and were successful in arguing that it provides a kind of embodied space that is theirs and that is intrinsic to the neighborhood. Language and discourse, I'm just give you an idea. I've begun studying co-ops and condominiums in New York City. Where language fits in here is, again, I study their social production, social construction, all that. But here, in my co-ops, people feel very safe, as opposed to the people I'm going to talk about in a minute in the gated communities who are terrified. And the reason they feel safe is because co-ops, which you may not know, have boards that decide who can enter or not. And therefore, everybody who lives there are people like us. So it becomes that, yeah, the language discourse becomes one that's very racialized, becomes very discriminating, which I hope to try to do something about, but even more importantly, creates a kind of idea that we're all homogeneous together. Fascinating is I have a colleague who works in Washington, D.C. in a co-op in which they use a discourse or a language. They talk about being one family. And by being a family, they can incorporate difference in this very culturally diverse neighborhood of Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C. They use the discourse, the talk, as a way to incorporate and suddenly make their co-ops really quite different than my co-ops, because they're not people like us, but in fact you recruit people through family terms. You call people brothers or uncles, so that the discourse can completely change the nature of something that is produced one way, has a governance structure and whatever, and this is what I'm currently working on now with condominiums. But I want to emphasize that language. And of course, Brooklyn co-ops. I'm just giving you affect and emotion. I have definitely taken on affect theory to go back over my gated community work. I've spent about 15 years studying gated communities. And, sorry. No, I guess you're going to have to see translocal. No? All right, well, there's a gated community. But the point I want to make about affect and emotion is I just don't think, I went to gated communities thinking that it was a spatially defined area and that space was important. I found that governance was important. I should reverse these slides, and that's how I got into co-ops, that the discourse was important. But what's really important here is the talk, obviously, the language, the talk of fear, but is the affective atmosphere that is produced by those walls and the kind of fear that it's generating in the mothers and the children and pervades the entire community, which completely changes this from a spatial form. It is a spatial designation. There are spatial relations, but it's the affective atmosphere that really creates a sense of place in this way, as does language in the previous. I'm not saying any of these, by the way, are mutually exclusive. Maybe that sounds like it. I'm saying that each is another way to understand how space and place, or if you prefer, space is made into place, that it happens in these different ways, that, and that from a methodological point of view, each is important. I really want to stop, but my last piece is on translocal space. And I have one paragraph I want to say a little bit about the geohumanities. But translocal space for me is where it's all going. I think that these are our new spaces of potential. I think this is where the future lies. And I think we really need to loosen up our ideas about how we're going to define place by people who are living their bodies are living these embodied in embodied spaces all over the world. And I think we have to begin, I personally think, interrogating and thinking about what that really means and how they're really experiencing the world from that point of view. And I'm not trying to be mentalist, I mean in a very embodied way. But when you're living in multiple places all of the time, what happens? Is there an interpenetration of these spatial worlds? Does space take on a thing? And also with communications, mediated space, how can we not take more seriously what it might be to be living in interpenetrated worlds all the time? Okay, so I know it's a little different than what we've been doing, but this is what I'm working on. And I think these approaches, with their methodological implications, will, I think, add to the rich and growing area of geohumanities. And yes, I think geohumanities exists. Certainly does on my campus. I mean, maybe we don't call it that, but we talk about space and humanities. A lot of our humanities seminars have focused on space. In a sense, I would argue many of the ethnographic techniques are already developed through international exchange. For example, the history of the plaza is certainly a humanities project, and the very best book ever written on gated communities is T.C. Boyle's Tortilla Curtain. He did a better job than I could ever do, and he never even lived in a gated community. Interdisciplinary developments have furthered my thinking, and certainly the digital humanities have much to offer, as do media and mediated studies of space and place. I think there's tremendous potential here, and although I don't know if I can claim to be part of your movement, I hope my ideas will be helpful and that ethnography and space and place will play a role in its evolution and flourishing. Thank you.
I know, thank you very much for all of those amazingly varied and interesting talks. I know Peter has to leave in about 5 minutes, and I knew that in advance, but I knew some people might overrun and stuff. So, if you want to come up to the front, and as I said, Peter probably has to leave in 5 minutes anyway. But if anyone has any questions, particularly directed at what Peter was talking about, it would be a good time to raise that. And when you're answering, you could use one of these microphones. That would be wonderful. We'll expend a little bit of time for conversation into the break.
So I think whenever we use them, we actually end up having to define what we're talking about, because I'm not sure we have a set of definitions.
Yeah. And I agree, and I think and I don't know how it's going to be settled, since, as I said, I'm writing a book on it, and my editor would really like me to settle it.
The notion that places have ways of both making visible and obscuring the kind of social processes that are working across space, that all of you, I think, have expressed a deep interest in. And I would just throw that out there as something that maybe perhaps you could highlight a little bit more, how that both either how places obscure those social processes or make them more visible, how that is important in your work. And Peter, I was actually specifically interested in how if the the physical places in those two regions that you discussed, where one region had the kind of interest that were more interested in a profit-driven society, and another region had more of a landed gentry society, if that expressed itself in physical form in any way, to your knowledge, if that came out as a difference.
Yeah, actually, I have to go back to Cambridge. In the middle of Cambridge Commons, we have a statue of somebody who was active during the Civil War, and I was thinking about that. I was listening and thinking about the plaza, and um, how do you mark the attributes of a place, right? And in fact, in China, but nowadays it's different. But in the past, there were never statues of people, right? There were never commemorations of individuals. Now there are, yeah. But that's sort of an imitation of what they see as modern, so-called modern phenomenon. And the so what is public space? What defines public space, right? That we can enter. In fact, it's not government, because government buildings are not public. They're for people who have power, and some towns have them and some towns don't. So that's one of the markers. But real public space is defined actually by religious sites, because religious sites are open, and it's the rebuilding of sites over time and the commemoration of them and the accrual of what might be called literary remains, inscriptions, and donor plaques and things like this, that gives a place a kind of a history. But precisely because they're public spaces with big buildings and big beams, and that's my cab calling, yeah, I'll be right there. um, they also are the first places to be destroyed, right?
Well, I have to just
Thanks,
say I was
Peter.
just in Taiwan, and Peter, you're totally right. I spent much of my life looking for public space in China or in Asia. And I finally came to this conclusion, just from observation, that the only places that are really public are the spaces outside the temple. And for the next talk I give tomorrow, I actually have some wonderful video of it and showing how it works as a public space. So I'm totally with you. But they are the ones, they're also controlled. They can be controlled, but they are the only true public space in, at least historically, but even in the present. I think that markets maybe markets, but markets are often related to those spaces, and they often are connected. I think you're absolutely right on.
So we better let Peter go. Thank you very much.
Just one teaching tool that I use to talk about that very issue is an old but great article by one of my heroes, Dennis Cosgrove, called The Myths and Stones of Venice. And it's literally about how stories about places then get put into stone, into buildings, into landscape, into place. The stories they can tell, and how that then both hides and can sometimes transgress the kind of social relations you might want to change. So it's a very empirical study, but I mean, to me, that's always, I use that in classwork to talk about Venice, but mostly to have students understand everywhere that they see and are. There are stories being told, and there are ways to untell them, but they're so powerful because they're in place, right? They are in your everyday. I mean, this room has embedded in it a whole set of social rules and relations that we're meant to be following, like sitting here and there, and I mean, all of that. So that to me is just always a great teaching for me, teaching for them. Every time I read it, I go, okay, that was good.
Beaches are really contested as well. I think it's of course, as geographers have always said, that the public-private is a very unclear division, and that we need to rethink what we're talking about, and we need to be much more precise. But there are some ways in which I draw lines, which was that McDonald's did have the right to call the police to move them out, which makes it less public. It makes it a private space that is trying to decide how public or how much it was going to offer it. And there's a lot of good research now on malls, which everybody says, are the new public spaces for lots and lots of communities. And so far, the legal status of being able to have political speech or to sit and stay has not been allowed. It was allowed, then it was changed. So I think that in places like New York, there's a really active struggle going on about what's going to constitute public or not. And a lot of it's going to be defined by surveillance, what I call securitization practices, which is the other thing I study. Yeah. That's right. It's the securitization practices, yeah, everywhere. And securitization practices have really limited who can be in public space, even when it's public, because certain people are targeted by policing cameras, other forms of surveillance, certain kinds of benches. I've been interviewed a lot recently on more defensive architecture, but all the public spaces that I studied when I first came to New York 20 years ago are gone. They are all have some kind of conservancy, some kind of private bid. Somebody is in control of making sure that not everybody can be there. And I think it's a great loss. And my plaza is part of what I don't get into it, but I really do think that diversity in public space is really is about social justice. And I think that the best spaces we can have a little bit of everyone, which includes a drug dealer and homeless individuals. But that position is getting really difficult to fight for. It's much safer, at least in the studies I've done in New York, in Costa Rica, in Bogota, a little bit in South Africa, friends of mine working. In general, having a stable ecology. Now, that doesn't mean People's Park, where it's all homeless individuals living there, and that other people are afraid to walk through. That doesn't qualify as a totally public yet, because it's become privatized in another form. But in the kinds of more organically occurring publics, I don't, with a lot of transgression as well as progressive activity going, those tend to be the safest spaces. The vendors, the drug dealers. The drug dealer is the one who calls the ambulance for the elderly person when she has a heart attack. It's two guys who are the alcoholics who live on this Denver plaza I worked on, who made sure that my hat got back to me when somebody took it. I mean, these are people. This is their space. They've appropriated, and we need to take a more humane and socially just view to our cities.
I would just add really quickly that it's just note that the narrative of the decline of public space has some problems too. So, for example, in this time that I'm looking at New York City, technically the streets of New York City are public, but in fact the behavior on those streets, it was completely controlled by social mores. And for example, women could not be walked. So so that whole story about that narrative
class,
is
gender,
yes, right,
yeah.
is a kind of narrative that has problems. So just to note that.
I think Laurie has a question over here.
Yeah,
She's going to get a microphone. Wait a minute.
share our microphone.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you for these papers. They were so fascinating to me, and for me, this is a just brilliant introduction to the field. I come from a remote place academically, but I wanted to ask about mechanisms that interfere with space becoming place. And I'm thinking of refugees and places where refugees are housed and located, and if and you know spaces that are named temporary as opposed to permanent, and are temporary for a very, very long time. I mean, you're CUNY, and I remember years and years ago I was there at Queens College in the English department in buildings that were called the Temps, and I learned that they were the Temps for 30 years. So, but I, you know, difference between refugees and temporary buildings on a college campus, but I just, that dynamic.
Yeah, but actually, there's several geographers working on the kind of placemaking capacity in those situations under the most duress, right? How is it that people make place in those kinds of circumstances? So there's actually some really interesting work thinking about that sort of status and all these kinds of, we even say liminal status, where you're sort of neither here nor there. How do you make place in those situations? If you say placemaking is one of the, well, I don't want to say things that make us human, but it's something that many of us share in common that seems to be quite universal. The ways in which that happens in those kinds of circumstances is quite amazing. There's actually a fabulous geographer at LSE, I think, who's doing work on the kind of ways that within these kind of very informal squatter settlements, we might say in India, the ways in which women have made, so they've been moved and pushed, how that placemaking capacities happen out in their, what would be their plaza. It's not their plaza, it's like their 4x6 space. And so in a very kind of ethnographically rich way. So it's just, I mean, I don't have the answer to that. It's an interesting to think through.
I like Catherine Brun's work a lot. She's an anthropologist, and why I like it is that she said what I really believe, that this whole notion uh, that refugees are misplaced or out of place, or that's fine to think about, but at another level they are in place, and that we need to think and do more fine grained ethnographies about the way place actually is being made, and give more credit to those individuals. One of the things I've been working on is trying to get public space, believe it or not, on the habitat agenda for UNESCO for 2000. I think it's 16 or maybe 18, because as you know, in many refugee camps, they are not allowed to have gathering spaces. And if any of you read the New York Times article about, I don't remember what it was. I think it's in the Gaza or Palestine. They were not allowed to have any public space, and they finally did put one in, and it became incredibly covered by kids and people playing and all of that. That I think the idea of making place is not just in the individual, internal, domestic, having a stable home, which is certainly important. I think we've substantiated that, but also is in these other kinds of spaces that I've become quite interested in, that create solidarity among people, that create safety and security through social relations, these other kinds of forms. So, yeah, I mean, but I think to take away placemaking status, ability from refugees, and this notion that they're stuck, that they have no life. I don't know if that's as the only way we want to talk about it or think about
I think I think we need a break. Oh, Kathleen had a question, so it's a final question. Then we'll have a break, and hopefully the conversation that we're going to have after the fellows, we can expand into more of these exciting issues. Kathleen?
I'll never look at department stores the same way again. Quite indignant. But what strikes me about both of your work is the tension between the top-down production of space and then the bottom-up appropriation of space. And it sounds that sounds really promising, but because I am completely cynical about social institutions, I think about Bakhtin's idea, the carnivalesque, the world upside down, only to reproduce the status quo. And so I'm thinking about how communities might say they're allowing space to be appropriated, but they always still control it. Is it possible for a true bottoms-up movement appropriation of space?
Absolutely. I think we've seen a lot of it in the past 5 years,
We've seen a ton of it. I mean, look at all the protests and uprisings. I have a student, Andy Newman, who's a professor at Penn State. He studied
Maghreb youth, North African youth in Paris. This is in Paris, I'm sorry, on the outskirts of Paris, who fight to appropriate this space that the designers had designed for them. And they were smart enough to use a kind of, I think smart enough, this is my interpretation of his, Andy may not agree, to use the sustainability discourse, language, as a way of, as a strategy for getting the kinds of things that they wanted in the park, and to be organized and in control and make it their own. I think we've got examples all over. I go all over the world all the time, and I think more and more and more you're seeing people take over their own spaces and make them their own. I'm not saying it's without struggle. I mean, isn't that what Dawn Mitchell's all about? And I think of that's what the geographers are all about. I talk about condensation in my plaza, but isn't that really what we're talking about?
And Even in department stores, then.
Even
The story I could tell is that it was the first gathering spot for women suffragettes in New York, in Stewart's, and so because they could, and their next step is they took over Delmonico's, which was like one of the first kind of restaurants. Of course, only men could be in restaurants. So yeah, even in that so-called controlled space, their thing, you can't control what was actually going to happen. So even in the department store.
And coffee shops in Cairo.